Hello, today I'm going to tell you the stories. The first one happened to me a couple of years ago, a night I still can't explain, where strange noses and eerie tapping outside my window left me terrified in my own home. The second is a story my grandmother shared with me from her childhood. She once met a mysterious girl named Anna on a train, only to discover later that Anna wasn't among the living. Both stories leave you wondering, both a little too close to the unknown. I can still feel the chill of that night, even though it happened 2 years ago. It's strange how some memories stick to you, refusing to fade. I've tried countless times to make sense of it, but nothing I come up with explains what happened. I live in a remote part of the Irish countryside, where things are quiet, too quiet at times. Most of the noises you hear at night are easy to explain. A stray cow wandering into our garden, the occasional dog barking at someone walking by. But this was something different. It was a late spring evening, one of those dark, clear nights where every star seems to shine brighter than usual. Around midnight, I headed into the kitchen, as most teenagers do, to grab a snack before bed. The house was silent except for the faint hum of the refrigerator and my own footsteps on the cold tile floor. As I reached for the cupboard, I heard something outside. It was faint at first, like the distant rustle of leaves. I didn't think much of it. Probably just an animal rummaging around. But as the sound grew louder, I paused, straining to hear. It wasn't just rustling anymore. It was more unsettling, a croaky, metallic screech, like nails scraping against something hard, only much deeper. I walked over to the window and peered outside. I expected to see nothing out of the ordinary, maybe a stray animal, or at worst a fox. But what I saw unnerved me in a way I've never felt before. My dog, a massive Newfoundland who rarely showed fear, was standing rigidly by the back door. She wasn't barking, which was strange in itself. She just stood there, her gaze locked on the tree line that bordered the woods behind our house. It was like she was frozen in place, too scared to move. The nose continued, that dreadful screech echoing through the night. My heart raced as I tried to make sense of it. If it was an animal, why wasn't my dog reacting? She was always quick to defend the house, barking at anything that came near. But not this time. This time she was silent, almost as if she was too afraid to make a sound. I hesitated for a moment, then decided to bring her inside. Whatever was out there, I didn't want her facing it alone. As soon as she was inside, I locked the door and tried to convince myself it was nothing, just some strange noise in the night. But deep down, I knew something was wrong. I went to bed, hoping that by morning, the whole thing would feel like a distant dream. But as I lay there, the sound seemed to follow me. It moved from the back of the house to the front, as if whatever was making it had circled around. It was impossible. Nothing could move that fast, especially not without making a sound. Besides that awful screech, my pulse quickened as the nose grew louder. I pulled the covers over my head, trying to block it out. But then something new happened. Tap, tap, tap. At first I thought I was imagining it, but then it came again. Tap, tap, tap. It was coming from my window. My mind raced as I stayed hidden beneath the covers. It sounded like small stones being thrown against the glass, one after another in a steady rhythm. My body was frozen, paralyzed with fear. I wanted to get up and look, but at the same time, I knew that whatever was outside, I didn't want to see it. I lay there, listening to the relentless tapping, my heart pounding in my chest. I don't know how long I stayed like that, curled up under the blankets. At some point, exhaustion must have taken over because the next thing I knew, it was morning, and the sun was streaming through the window. The tapping had stopped. The sound was gone. Everything was eerily quiet, like the night before had never even happened. But it did happen. I knew it did. Later that day, I went to talk to my neighbors. We lived far enough apart that we didn't interact often, but I had to know if anyone else had heard anything strange the night before. One of my neighbors mentioned that a man had recently moved into a house not too far from ours. There were whispers about him, that he wasn't exactly the law-abiding type. Some said he was a drug dealer involved in some shady business. I didn't think much of it at the time, but a month later, there was a raid on a shed just down the road from me. The police found a massive stash of weed and other drugs hidden there. The man who lived nearby was nowhere to be found. He disappeared almost as suddenly as he had arrived, and I never saw him again. I spent a lot of time thinking about that night. The logical part of me wants to believe that it was him, that he was high on something and trying to mess with me. But then, there's the part of me that can't shake the feeling that it was something else, something I can't explain. How could he have made that noise for hours on end? How did he move so quickly around the house, making no other sounds? And why was my dog, of all things, so terrified? I'll never know for sure what happened that night, but I still wonder what would have happened if I had gone to the window. What would I have seen? And most importantly, what were its or his intentions? That summer night in Dudley, I sat on the porch with my grandmother, the warm air swirling around us. She seemed distant, lost in thought, her eyes searching the horizon as if she were remembering something long buried. After a long pause, she sighed and began speaking in a voice I had never heard from her before, softer, almost like a whisper, as if she were sharing a secret meant only for the night. You know, there's something I never told anyone, she began, her hands resting on the small bundle wrapped in a handkerchief that she always kept close. Not your mother, not even my own. I don't think anyone would have believed me anyway. I leaned in closer, intrigued by this sudden change in tone. My grandmother wasn't the type to keep secrets, but now I could see there was a deep sadness, something weighty in her voice, and I knew I was about to hear something important. It happened when I was about 8, she continued. We were traveling by train to visit some relatives. Back then, trains were different, not like they are today. They were slower, quieter, more mysterious. I was sitting by myself, staring out the window, watching the countryside blur by when I noticed her. I raised an eyebrow. Her, I asked. She nodded, her eyes distant as if she could still see the girl in her mind's eye. A girl about my age, sitting in the corner of the car. She was quiet, playing with a few toys on the floor. At first, I thought it was strange because I hadn't seen her when we boarded the train, but children noticed children, and I felt drawn to her. Did you talk to her? I asked, hanging on to her every word. Yes, my grandmother said. I was confused at first because she motioned for me to come over, but no one else seemed to notice her. I even pointed to myself, thinking she must be calling for someone else, but she nodded, and so I went. My grandmother's hands, trembling slightly, began to stroke the handkerchief in her lap as she continued. Her name was Anna. I remember how nervous she looked, rubbing her hands together, almost like she was afraid I wouldn't come. When I sat down beside her, she smiled, but it was the saddest smile I had ever seen. "Would you like to play with me?" she asked. I don't see many children my age on the train. A chill ran down my spine as my grandmother spoke, her voice so thick with emotion that it was as though she was reliving that moment. I told her, "Of course, I'll play with you," and she seemed so relieved, like she had been waiting for me. She handed me a small rag doll with a missing button and said, "Her name is Susie. I want you to have her." I didn't want to take it. I could tell it was important to her, but she insisted, and we played for a while. We didn't talk much. There wasn't much to say. It was just the two of us and the sound of the train rolling along the tracks. I could feel the hairs on my neck standing up as my grandmother spoke. Her voice was full of longing, and the story felt like something out of a dream, something half-remembered yet crystal clear. After some time, she continued. I asked her where she was going, and she just looked away and shrugged. "I don't think I'll ever get there," she said. "I tried once when my parents were with me, but ... single quotes, and she didn't finish. She just stared at the door of the next train car, and I remember feeling so sorry for her. I thought she had lost her parents. Her voice cracked, and I could see the years hadn't dulled the impact of that moment. I wanted to say something to comfort her, but just then, an announcement came over the intercom. The train was approaching the next station, and everyone was asked to remain seated. My father called my name, and I turned to see him walking over. Concerned, my grandmother's eyes flickered as if she were seeing the memory play out in front of her. He asked me, "Mary Ann, what are you doing on the floor?" I told him I was playing with Anna, and I turned to point her out, but when I looked, she was gone. Just like that, she had disappeared. I tried to explain to him, to show him the doll she had given me, but he just shook his head and said, "No one was there." I was so confused. I knew Anna had been there. We had played together, talked together, and I had Susie the doll to prove it. Her hands moved to unwrap the bundle in her lap, revealing the same worn rag doll with the missing button eye. My breath caught in my throat. "But your father didn't believe you?" I asked. "No," she said softly, shaking her head. "He thought I had found the doll somewhere and made up a story to go along with it. But I knew what I saw. I knew Anna was real. When we got off the train, I was so upset. I held on to that doll like it was the only thing that connected me to her. And then," she continued, her voice lowering to a near whisper, "as we were leaving the station, we passed a memorial. It was full of flowers, candles, and photographs, and there right in." And then, she continued, her voice lowering to a near whisper, "as we were leaving the station, we passed a memorial. It was full of flowers, candles, and photographs, and there, right in the middle, was a picture of Anna." I gasped, "A picture of Anna? But how?" "My father saw it too," my grandmother said, her eyes misting over. "He looked at me with such sadness, and then I realized ... Anna wasn't just any girl. She had been a victim in a train robbery gone terribly wrong. A man had tried to rob the passengers, but things had escalated, and many people, including Anna, had been killed. Her picture was part of a memorial to those who had died." I sat in stunned silence, unable to speak. My grandmother had been playing with a ghost, a real ghost. I stood there, looking at the picture, holding the rag doll she had given me, and I didn't know what to think. It was all too much. But then I felt something warm, like a weight had been lifted off my shoulders, and I heard a small voice in my ears, soft but clear. "Thank you," it said. I knew it was Anna, somehow, I had helped her find peace. My grandmother smiled softly as she wrapped a rag doll back up in the handkerchief. I like to think that Anna finally went home. She said that she found her parents wherever they were, and that she's no longer the lonely little girl on the train. I nodded, feeling a strange sense of peace wash over me as well. I hope so too, I whispered. I hope she's home.